I see covert action in a fairly simple way. It's one aspect of clandestine or clandestine, if you prefer, behavior. You have intelligence gathering, one has counterintelligence, and one has covert action. And I would say covert action is distinguished by what I would call a positive, and I don't mean in a value sense, but by a conscious attempt to affect the political, economic, or military situation in a certain country. By that sense, I mean it is an active step, not passive, and the idea is simply trying to learn more, but one is seeking to change things there, to leave the place a different place than one found it, if you will. And on the screen there, on the board rather, you have a listing of quite a few different types, and I think that generally sums it up. When I was thinking about the question of the relationship between covert actions and the ethical considerations for a democratic society, I asked a few people who had done a lot of work in the field whether there was anything to read or anything, and people said no, not a lot. And I said, is there anyone in particular you should talk to? And they gave me the name of one priest in the Washington, D.C. area, and I couldn't find him. So as usual, I was left to my own resources. So what you get here is what my journalist friends call a thumbsuck, which is what happens when you've got a deadline and there's no obvious event that has happened to give you a story to write. So instead, you start talking about mysterious sources and all that, and you do a thumbsuck piece, and it's your view of the world. And this is what you will get, which is my thumbsuck on this. I thought that in talking about the ethical questions of covert operations for a democratic society, it might be useful to divide it up into three separate questions. And this is arbitrary, and I, in a sense, look forward to hearing what you've got to say about it, because I'm sure that both you and also Howard Zinn here have dimensions and aspects of it that I haven't thought of. But let me give you three separate ethical questions or considerations that I came up with, and then say a few about each. The first question in an ethical environment that I think covert action brings up is whether or not it is ethical in the sense for ourselves in terms of decision making. I think you would all agree that covert action, almost by definition, if it is to remain covert, involves a decision-making process that is very narrow. It is, if at one end of the spectrum one has presidential politics and fairly direct participation of most Americans, covert action is somewhat near the other end of that spectrum. It is a very, very narrow group indeed of people who decide major issues, in some cases life or death. So it raises the ethical problem for any democratic society that we are then entrusting a very, very select few to make decisions for all of us. And it seems to me that therefore that creates at times possible ethical problems for the rest of us, because things are being done in our name that we may not agree with. And the question is then, should we give this type of a blank check to individuals within our society? And the way I think one answers that, and it's not a perfect answer, but one can simply point out two things. One is, even though the participation in the decisions as to whether or not to have a covert action must of course be narrow, it still does include people within the executive branch who represent quite a few constituencies. In a sense, one does not simply leave the decisions over covert action up to those who would undertake the covert actions. One does not have those in the operations part of the CIA, for example. They are not judge and jury. They are simply advocates. And most often, though not always, they are the advocates for a particular operation. But one has a fairly broad range of people within the executive branch, people elsewhere in the intelligence community, but also people in the Defense Department, people in the State Department, people at the White House, also people abroad, for example, our ambassador within a certain country where proposed operation would take place. So there is a fairly elaborate decision-making process within the executive. I, for example, was involved in it both when I worked in the Defense Department and again when I worked in the State Department, and an awful lot of people had a chance to get their oar in. And secondly, the Congress is then involved, and there is the entire role of congressional oversight. So it's not simply those in the executive branch who may have a certain stake in doing something, but an outside agency, if you will, the Congressional Intelligence Committees, also have a chance at the policy. So I think what we've done here is in some ways try to straddle this dilemma between the need for secrecy, yet the need for a covert instrument, and it's one of the ways in which we as a representative society, rather than a purely democratic one, have come up with an answer. And in this, it is not that different really from many other sensitive areas of foreign or defense policy, or I would argue even many other areas of public policy which aren't sensitive at all. We have a representative system. We do not have direct participatory democracy on every issue. Every time we're deciding whether to do something or not, we do not have a plebiscite or a referendum. And I think here what we have basically done is narrowed down the participation, but I think we've narrowed it down at the same time that we tried to build in enough safeguards to balance our interests. So I think one can square the process with the ethical requirements of democracy. Secondly, the second ethical question I would ask about covert actions is whether one can find them consistent with the whole notion of what our role in the world should be. To be frank, there is something that's somewhat distasteful about covert actions to many people. It's something unsavory. It constitutes a form of interference. So who are we, the United States, or for that matter any country, to interfere, to violate the sovereignty, to try to manipulate developments within the borders of another country? After all, don't these people deserve the right to their own futures, to make their own mistakes, to make their own choices? Who are we to, in some ways, interfere, intervene, manipulate? Isn't that inherently unethical? And to that, again, I'm not sure it is a perfect answer, but let me give three other considerations that I think would have to be added to the mixture. The first would be that no country lives in some kind of splendid isolation. We are all constantly being manipulated by one another, not simply by covert actions, but by overt actions. In the covert area, countries have to accept the fact that others will also try to influence them. Before the United States acts in a covert fashion, it may also have to accept, and it may or may not know about it, that others are also using this tool. So we are not somehow fouling a rather pristine environment. The environment is already somewhat muddy or murky in this area. Secondly, we interfere in many other ways, and I put the word interference in quotes. We interfere by decisions we make at the World Bank about whether or not to extend certain types of loans or credits. We interfere every day by what American businesses decide to do in their boardrooms, whether or not they decide to invest. We interfere by what we put on our radios, by what we put on our television, by what we trade, by what we don't trade, what items we make available, what items we don't. We interfere by our regulations on our borders, who we let in, who we don't. We interfere every time we travel or decide not to travel. The international environment, it seems to me, is one in which the concept of absolute sovereignty is quite far from reality. And covert action, I would argue, is a particular form of interference, but it is hardly unique in that it constitutes interference. And perhaps most important to justify any ethical dilemma on the question of whether or not covert actions constitute a form of interference that is inherently unethical is I would simply argue that some interests are worth interfering on. That I can imagine certain situations, let me just throw out a few, where we would have hard information that a country is developing a nuclear or chemical capability and plans to use it. Would that not possibly constitute a situation where some interference on our part would indeed be desirable? Or we have firm information or indications that a country is practicing genocide, either within its own borders or against its neighbors. Do we not have then a certain stake, a certain interest in interfering? Where certain people are fighting for certain human rights or political rights, again, ask our help. It can only be done in a way that would be through a covert means. Again, are there not some interests worth interfering on? I would say yes. Lastly, beyond the question of our own decision-making and beyond the question of whether interference is somehow inherently unethical, and again, in that case I would say not, is the question of means. Whether, even if you are with me this far, that you agree that one can square covert actions with our democracy and one can somehow justify the notion of interference, the question is, can one support many of the means up on that list? Whether it is bribery or certain types of payments under the table, or at the extreme, assassination. Whether the form that covert actions takes or might take is inherently unethical. And this goes back to the rather traditional notion of Henry Stimson, the Secretary of State some 60 or 70 years ago, whose view was basically that gentlemen do not read one another's mail. And that somehow these covert actions are inherently unsavory, and that we commit an ethical crime, if you will, by undertaking them. And to that, my only argument would be, I don't think one can come up with an answer, that it depends upon the ends to which the means are used. And that may be a moral cop-out to some, but all I would argue that even the most extreme means, and in that I knowingly include assassination, I would argue that even the most extreme means can be justified by the ends. which is another way of arguing that covert operations are neither inherently ethical nor unethical by themselves. It depends upon the context, which is really the only other thing I wanted to say in conclusion, which is that I would view covert actions as simply an instrument of foreign policy. It is a neutral instrument. It can be appropriate or inappropriate. It can be effective or ineffective. It can be costly. It can be inexpensive. It simply is there as an instrument, if you will, in the kit bag of the United States. The real issue to me is not covert action. That to me is not ultimately the interesting question. The interesting question is covert action on behalf of what? What ultimately is interesting to me and what ultimately is critical is not the means, but is the ends. And if we have certain ends that we want to pursue, certain objectives, that to me is a legitimate area for domestic and indeed public debate. Then one has to tailor the particular foreign policy instrument to that. Covert action is one possible instrument that one would want to use. As a result, I can only argue for a case-by-case approach, that one wants to have a mechanism of careful examination of options or possibilities for covert action. One wants to have safeguards built into the system, so politically a good number of people can see it without compromising the secrecy, but I emphasize that one wants to have safeguards and not prohibitions. I do not think we want to deny ourselves the possible use of this instrument. I think as a result, what is key then are circumstances, and that one cannot come up with an absolutist position on this instrument. One simply has to look at the circumstances and make your judgment. So then my bottom line would be, coming back to the question of this debate, whether or not they are consistent with the ethics of a democratic society. I say in principle, yes. And that one would have to prove in an individual case that they were not. And if in that individual case, if the arguments were against it, I would say, fine, let's not proceed in this individual instance. But I would think it would be a grave error, or to use Bismarck's terminology, worse than an error, a blunder, for the United States to deny itself this potentially useful and necessary instrument of foreign influence.
Thank you. That gets us off to a good start. Howard Zinn needs no introduction to Boston audiences. Professor of Political Science at Boston University. Professor Zinn.
I have to drop what I was going to talk about, and because you provoked me. I know you didn't intend to, but it happened. I was just thinking, if I had descended from another planet and listened to your discussion of covert action, I would find very little to quarrel with, because essentially you're discussing it in a kind of abstract void in which history is absent, in which you consider logical possibilities. And yes, speaking of it that way, it is possible to think covert action can be either bad or good, depending on the circumstances. Can't argue with that. It's because somebody can conceivably come up with situations in which some sort of covert action might be necessary in order to save many, many lives, right? And in fact, you gave an example of that, genocide and somebody developing some threatening capability and so on. So theoretically, it is possible to imagine covert action as being good or bad. I agree. But let me start by saying that I think your first point of dealing with the issue of democracy slides too easily over the issue of democracy and covert action. And that is that you grant that covert action is at the other end of the spectrum from presidential action where there's some element of representation. Actually, in foreign policy, representative government hardly exists. Now, I'm not talking about the Constitution and its provisions and the House, that Congress has the right to declare war and Senate has the right to ratify treaties. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about historical reality. And in the historical reality of our time, the president and a small group of people around him, now you might say, no, it's a large group. It's not 5, it's 12. It's not 12, it's 23. I'm not comforted by that thought. I'm not comforted by knowing that it wasn't 3 people who planned the Vietnam War, but 42. At that end, the better end of the spectrum, the more representative end of the spectrum, at the presidential end of the spectrum, we do not have representative government because people vote for the president not knowing what the president will do 2 months after he is elected. And we have had historical experience where presidents have voted into office on the basis of saying they will keep us out of war, and almost immediately they get us into war. And Lyndon Johnson in 1964, right, running against the Hawk, Barry Goldwater, a good example. People vote for the Dove, they get a war very quickly. Where is representative government there? And then if you go from that already bad end of the spectrum, and we can multiply the instances from the Gulf of Tonkin and so on. We can bring it right down to the representative government. Let's keep it at the better end of the spectrum, the presidency. More representative than a little covert group. And how is it represented in the presidency? The president is not elected with his voters knowing how he's going to behave in this or that. In fact, there's a lot of discordance between the views of voters as shown in public opinion polls and the actions of presidents again and again. As shown by the president on the nuclear freeze, as shown by the president on aid to the Contras, difference between the president and public opinion surveys. But in this action, where, you say Congress, there's Congress. Now, Congress, in the case of the Vietnam War, was simply a bunch of sheep. They accepted the words on the Gulf of Tonkin. They accepted lies about the Gulf of Tonkin. They didn't question. They voted unanimously in the House. They voted with only 2 dissenting voices in the Senate. Congress was nowhere. And then, again and again through the war, they voted the monies for the war. And they were late in questioning what was going on in Vietnam. It was a presidential war. There was no representative government there. And then if you move to the worst end of the spectrum, to covert action, no matter how many people you include in that covert action, it is very, very far from the representative process. The fact is that in foreign policy, we do not have very much democracy, not even representative democracy, let alone direct democracy. Let's leave that for the moment. But on the other questions, here's where we get into the difference between an abstraction and history. And you talk about interference. Covert action means interference. And you say, well, of course, there's lots of yes, the world is full of interference. Surely you don't want a world in which nobody ever interferes with anybody else. Well, of course not. It's a wonderful way of arguing, of starting with an unarguable proposition that is moving away from absolutes and getting people to say, well, yes, it depends on, right? And then letting that cloud descend immediately over the specific historical things that are taking place. So, not knowing how the United States interfered in Chile, not knowing how the United States interfered in Cuba, not knowing how the United States interfered in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, not knowing how the United States has interfered in the affairs of Central America all through this century and before, one might say, well, interference, it all depends. Well, yes, it all depends. There is I can imagine benign interference, of course. You help people who are starving and you give them food. Or yes, people are subject to genocide. There might be a time when you might go in and save people from genocide. But that's not our historical record. That's not what we did in Cuba. That's not what we did in Chile. That's not what we did in Guatemala. We interfered in Guatemala and Chile, particularly egregious examples of bad interference, democratically elected governments, and we moved in to overthrow those governments. That's bad interference. Not only that, the consequence of that was to set up in both countries military dictatorships of such a brutal nature, we would hesitate to begin to detail here all of the instances of brutality that occurred in those regimes. That's the kind of interference we have had, historically, really, in the real world, not abstractly as a matter of, well, there's good interference and there's bad. You say, well, it's the means. Well, we all know about covert action and means, the means that are used, the means of the CIA, lying, deception, disinformation, propaganda, planting things, false letters, forgeries, burglaries, stealing, poisoning, assassinations, or trying to assassinate. They don't always work. And we know about, yes, interfering in other people, all of these means, bad means, bizarre means, you know, trying to get some sort of crocodile serum that will poison, sending people to Africa to find the crocodile. I mean, there are weird things that go on. Means, yes. But, you know, doctoring up Fidel Castro's shoes, working on his diving helmet because he likes to dive, well, you know, bizarre means, and also gentlemanly means. Not bizarre, just ordinary shooting. Executing 20,000 people in Operation Phoenix in Vietnam, a nice CIA operation without benefit of trial. Somebody points something out as a possible Viet Cong suspect, we shoot him. 20,000. Means. Those are ugly means. But if the end is good, that sounds like Lenin. Really. That's exactly what we accused Lenin of. That's what we accused the Bolsheviks of at their worst. Anything for socialism, comrades. Anything for democracy, my good friends. Really. The means. No, the means can be so bad as to poison the ends. And the means in Vietnam, what was that end? Saving the world from communism? Saving South Vietnam from North Vietnam? Well, the end was hazy. The end was uncertain. The means were certain. And this is a problem, always. The means are clear. The end is rarely clear. And because of that, it is absolutely essential that means be scrupulously inspected, because you never know what the end is going to be. And if you know that the means are ugly, you had better think twice, 10 times, 20 times. And there are some means that cannot be tolerated in any society priding itself on morality and ethics, especially because you don't know what the ends are going to be. So, I agree. Again, coming from the moon, a case-by-case approach. You look at our cases. Look at Nicaragua, look at El Salvador. Look at the CIA by covert action paying $90,000 to Carranza, head of the Treasury Police, and the Treasury Police among the notorious participants in the death squads in El Salvador. That's case by case. And there are lots of other cases in El Salvador. Case by case, interference in El Salvador, military assistance to El Salvador again and again and again. Despite Congress saying, oh, you must certify that there's an improvement in civil rights, the death squads continue, and the certification by the Reagan administration continues again and again and again. Case by case. Nicaragua, the CIA's finance organized, set up the Contras. The Contras kill, the Contras mutilate, I'm not talking now about what the Sandinistas do, because there is that ultimate excuse. They do it too. Really? They do it too. Somebody has to break the cycle of immorality in the world. We have to refuse to join this game of endless retaliation, of terrorism upon terrorism, evil upon evil. And we have to do it with the very first case that comes to our attention tomorrow. Thank you.
I have a sneaking suspicion that Richard Haas might have some responses, but I also have a sneaking suspicion, since he's been in the classroom before and had a lot of other kinds of experience, that he will find ways in response to your questions to produce some of the responses that he has to Professor Zinn, and I suspect the other way around will also be the case. So why don't we invite your participation here and leave their internal responses to their own ingenuity, at least for the start. Sir.
The first question is for Professor Zinn. Of course assassination is a terrible thing, but knowing what we do about World War II, if you could go back in time, would you assassinate Adolf Hitler?
Would I go back in time? I have. I've tried. Probably. Yes, there are circumstances. There are no absolutes. And and I agree. But our problem is that once you find an example that allows you to say, yes, so we are ethically justified in doing this, you'd better be very sure that your next example matches. Because the problem with evil is that we go from good examples to bad ones. And analogies are very dangerous. And we, again and again, and this is one of the problems in the world today, is we keep going back to World War II and using the analogies of World War II. We live in a different world now, and a much more complex world. And we can't use that simple equation that we had, that really was a very simple equation in World War II, and the fascism, Nazis, so clear, so obvious, right? And the world is more complicated today. And let's not use those analogies as bases for dealing with the very complicated situations we have.
Yes, ma'am.
The questioner believes that the more we engage in covert actions, the more we undermine representative and perhaps direct democratic controls over these things, so that the more secret covert actions get, the less ethical. Does either speaker have a comment?
I agree. There's something inherently, even if we grant that there may be circumstances in which you could detect a situation where covert action might be beneficial to mankind and might save us against, from some terrible evil. In the main, covert action leans towards, the great probability is that covert action is going to be undertaken by a small group of people. And the problem is, it's not undertaken by objective people who are sort of sitting up there above the world, making decisions on the basis of some very galactic judgment. It's made by very real people with very real interests, political and economic interests. And we can't trust them to make the right judgments. We would do better, given the probabilities, given the fact it isn't, well, it might be good or it might be bad, given the 98% probability that covert action will be bad based on its history, we would be wise to rule out covert action altogether. Of course, we can't rule it. It's going to happen. But all we can do is create some very powerful public outcry against the things that do happen when they do happen. And at a certain level of public participation, the President, Congress seem to want to respond somewhat, and that's all what we can hope for.
It's interesting. What we're moving towards is almost a political philosophical discussion about the benefits or risks of representative government as opposed to democracy. And you start hearing a word like trust. And the question is how comfortable or not you feel with trusting, if you will, your elected or unelected officials. And one has to look at their past behavior, one has to look at their present situation, and so forth. I would just say two things on that. One is I think a degree of trust is unavoidable. And I just do not think in virtually any aspect of our society we can function on the basis of direct democracy. Whether it's economic policy, what the interest rate should be. We're not going to have direct democracy instead of the Federal Reserve Board. We have representative government there. I think in foreign policy and intelligence policy, one has to narrow it down again much more for secrecy. I think that is inevitable, and as a result, a degree of trust, I think, is one of the ways in which, ironically enough, you need in order to sustain democracy. In a sense, one has to give up a bit of democracy in order to sustain it. I just do not think we can have a functioning democracy that is pure. I think, though, in the intelligence area, there is, as Professor Zinn pointed out, given the historical record and given all sorts of other considerations, there is an element of risk. He would argue more of an element of risk than I would, obviously, but there is an element of risk that these actions could be unethical or counterproductive or whatever. And that, from my way of thinking, is the reason that, for example, you do not have those who are advocating these actions also passing decision on them. I would oppose a system where the operations directorate of the CIA decided what it was going to do that afternoon. I think that would be fairly unhealthy and probably dangerous. And I think what you've got now is a system of a degree of checks and balances. It is not as far as many of you would like to see, but I do not see how you can sustain covert actions and have a significantly broader decision-making process. There's a tension between the two. And I think where we've come to now is historically very open. Compared to where we were 10 or 20 years ago, we have clearly moved along the spectrum towards a greater degree of participation. I sense from what I'm hearing is that many of you would like to move it even farther along, to open up the process towards even greater participation. All I would say is at some point you reach a line which you then cross in which you can no longer have covert operations. And there's a tension there. There's possibly a dilemma. One has to choose what, the risk you want. The risk of more covert actions which go sour, or the risk of compromising your ability to conduct covert actions. And I think, in a sense, you have to choose. What you see right here is probably a slightly different choice.
Yep.
The questioner asks, since those who make decisions on covert actions do not answer to voters, how can that be justified as representative government?
I think you're right. They are not answerable to many people, and there's no way to solve that problem if you describe it as a problem. I would say there's no way to totally eliminate the possible tension in a democratic society and having certain actions taken in the name of the state or conducted by the state or conducted with the state's resources that are not made available or open to public scrutiny or to public decision. That is just one of the compromises we make because of the kind of world we live in. And I don't mean that tritely. It just seems to me that that is where we are. Because what representative government means to me is that one has officials, elected officials, who then are in the position to appoint officials who make decisions for the rest of us. And that is what representative government is all about, is that one has, at times, if you will, a layer or a coterie of people who, because of knowledge or background or whatever, or just the time to devote to certain technical problems, are put in a position where, in a sense, we ask them to help manage certain elements of our public life. We ask the Federal Reserve Board to help manage certain elements of our economic life. We ask the Foreign Service to manage certain elements of our foreign policy. I think here, you're getting down to a very, very small bunch of people. There is probably no area of public life which is not only, which has, one, so few people involved, and two, no public scrutiny. At least the Federal Reserve Board, their decisions are then open to public scrutiny. Here, they're not. So I agree. It is a situation which is more fraught with risk than other areas, but again, I see no way to solve the problem, quote unquote, without making it worse.
Well, as you said, by making it worse, you mean not having covert action, which is what I have suggested, that we not have covert action, because just looking at the covert actions we've had, we can very well do without them, and the number of people who've been killed by them could certainly very well do without them. Now, I wanted to respond to what you said because I thought you were, Mr. Haas is saying, well, look, you can't avoid the fact that covert action is not full representative government. It is sort of indirectly representative government, right? But I thought you were saying that, granted that the people who engage in covert action don't have an immediate constituency which they are responsible to, I thought you were saying there are certain influences on them, certain constituencies, that have much more influence on covert action than other constituencies. So it's not that we are all of us in the country are in the same position with regard to the makers of covert action. In 1954, the American population in general was not in the same position as the directors of United Fruit Company when it came to planning the coup in Guatemala. And in 1973, the American public did not have the kind of influence on what the covert actors in the government were doing as IT&T did. There are, in other words, it's disingenuous, as we say. I always like that euphemism. It's disingenuous, as we say, to suggest that, well, we're all in the same boat. It's just a problem with covert action. We're not all in the same boat. It's the Titanic. There are people who are, right, in the steerage, and there are people who get out fast. And that's one good reason for doing away with that very vicious and undemocratic process of covert action.
The questioner points out that Mr. Haas implicitly compared the Central Intelligence Agency to the Federal Reserve Bank. Are you saying that we have to pay a certain price for representative government? Are actions such as those of the CIA in Chile and the Bay of Pigs the price for a democratic society?
It's simply to say, to draw the parallel, nothing more, nothing less, than we have representative institutions in our society in virtually every sphere of our society. But I think I did go on to make the case that covert actions is a very, very special subset of a representative institution within our society. And the parallel was meant nothing more, nothing less. It's not something that I think we can usefully spend an hour talking on. The question of, the larger question you asked, which is about what the CIA does really. Again, in some cases historically, I would agree with you. What we did in Guatemala in the early 50s, I find hard to justify. What we did in Chile in 1973, I think was a shame, simply because I think Allende was falling of his own weight. And I would have much preferred Allende to have fallen simply through his own economic mismanagement, through domestic forces in Chilean society, which is what I think overwhelmingly caused his downfall. And I think it was unfortunate that the CIA got involved, because it allowed a lot of people who were apologizing for Allende to blame it on what the CIA did. And I think that's just a fundamental misreading of the Chilean experience of the early 1970s. But looking at the situation now, when I look at what the CIA is doing in lots of areas, to the extent I can talk about it, my feeling is in some cases it's just fine. If I look at what we're doing in Nicaragua, lots of us can argue that, but again, given my sense of American foreign policy interests, I feel comfortable with the use of covert operations there. So I feel that yes, in certain places historically, the CIA's record is filled with blemishes, and it has not only been perhaps ethically something that makes us uncomfortable, but from my point of view, even worse, it has been counterproductive as a foreign policy instrument.
The questioner asked Professor Zinn, if we eliminate covert actions, what do we do about a situation such as Libya? And he asked Professor Haas, what is the difference between what Libya does and what the United States does in covert actions?
The question about Libya is based on the notion, which has been assiduously spread by the administration and helped along by the press, that somehow Libya is the source of terrorism in the world, and if we could only take care of Libya, then somehow that problem would be solved. And I think that's a terrible misreading of what's been happening in the world. Even the so-called experts on terrorism, I'm sorry for calling them so-called, I'm a so-called also. We're all so-calls. Even they, the rather conservative people in Washington, say that it's not, Libya, Gaddafi is not a critical element in whatever terrorism goes on in the world. And besides, terrorism is very widespread in the world. It's not just Libya. It's it's the Soviet Union, Afghanistan. It's the United States and Nicaragua. And the superpowers carry on terrorism on a much greater scale than Libya or the Palestinians, right? And there are roots. There are socio-economic roots of terrorism, and there may be no ultimate answer but the people who are terrorists are not simply mad people. Right? They're not like mad bombers, people who've been, taken too many drugs and go off and shoot somebody, right? They have, beneath their fanaticism, there is some political motive, just as beneath Reagan's fanaticism, there is a political motive. I mean, they're both engaging in terrorism. They're both killing innocent people for political purposes, which is terrorism. And you can't get rid of the problem by getting rid of Gaddafi or Libya. You can't get rid of the problem by getting rid of Reagan. You can't do it that way. There are very serious problems in the world which we have to solve, or begin to solve in any way. Certainly in the Middle East, there's a very specific problem of the Palestinians and their homeland, which has been at the root of much of the Palestinian terrorism, which has then led to Israeli terrorism. Really. So we have to somehow get at that problem. Let me say one thing about this, because this touches not just the question of covert action, but touches the whole question of our foreign policy, which Mr. Haas referred to, because really, ultimately, it's a question not just of the CIA, not just of covert action, it's a question of overt action, of our foreign policy in general. And that is that there's something fundamentally wrong, bad, unethical about the suppositions of our foreign policy. And one of them is that we can solve whatever problems there are in the world by military action. As Duarte at one point said to the United States, look, let's go easy on the guns. I need more economic aid. The United States, guns is what you need. Yeah.
I knew if we kept talking, we would reach some points of fundamental disagreement. And
I kind of suspected the same thing.
We've now arrived there fully and completely. This is a rich menu I've just been handed. First, whether or not Libya is the principal or the only source of international terrorism is completely besides the point. It is a source of international terrorism. No one can argue that. Secondly, there is a fundamental, we'll use the word ethical difference between Libyan policy and American policy. I would argue that there is a fundamental, basic distinction between the specific conscious, intentional targeting of innocent civilians, which is the single product of purpose of Libyan terrorism, and the purpose of American response, which is the targeting of the people and the capacities behind it, and at the same time a degree of collateral damage in which innocent civilians did get hurt. There's a fundamental moral distinction. And to blur those is the problem. If one looks back at the last several hundred years of Islamic history, there are other periods of this extreme form of anti-Western thinking. What we have now, unfortunately, is the marrying up of this anti-Western hostility with modern technology, communications, transportation, guns and the like, explosives. This is nothing fundamentally new or different, but we are deluding ourselves if we think anything in the realm of traditional politics, anything like a so-called reasonable compromise on the West Bank or Gaza, will satisfy Gaddafi or anyone like that. They do not work that way. Our type of calculus is not theirs. Beyond that, they would be satisfied with nothing less than the destruction of Western values. These people are extreme xenophobics. They are anti-Western. They are nothing new in the Islamic world. Lastly, I agree with Professor Zinn. He is offering you what I would call a radical critique of American foreign policy. It is a fundamentally radical critique, and it's quite nice to finally be on a panel with someone who's offering a radical critique, because lots of other people, I think, don't have the intellectual courage to do it. And he is offering you a very different role for the United States in the world, one in which the United States would make much less use, not simply of covert actions, but would have a much narrower definition of its interests abroad, and would be much less willing to use military force on behalf of its interests. And that is a coherent body of thought, and it's a coherent view of what one role is for the United States in the world. I would argue a very, very different one, in which the United States has a broader set of interests, and that the nature of the world is such the United States has to use military force to defend those interests, and that one other tool of defending American interests is covert action. And I think that it is probably not consistent to argue for a certain role for the United States in the world, and not then argue for the tools to maintain those interests, which would be military force and covert action. Lastly, one last point, and I apologize. I will not go into a long debate over El Salvador or over the Philippines, other than to say that the bulk of our aid in both countries has gone for economic purposes, and in those countries you do not have the choice of simply saying only a military threat, meet that, or only an economic threat, meet that. You've got to do both. Mrs. Aquino has to transform the Philippine economy, which has been ravaged. At the same time, she has to do something about the military insurgency. Napoleon Duarte has to do something about economic growth and land reform in that country. At the same time, he has to defeat an insurgency. If either of those leaders chooses to only attack one, they will not be leaders for long. It is not a choice between the economic and the military. You've got to use both.
Professor Zinn, political action, supporting friends, organizing friends. Is that acceptable to you? We know where you are on small wars and sabotage and bribery and some of those fun things. Would you say supporting friends and organizing friends under political action framework, or would you rule that out also?
Depends on who you consider a friend. Somoza was our friend, and Trujillo was our friend, and Pinochet was our friend, and Marcos was our friend, and all these people were our friends. The question, we should support our friends? No. We should not support people who are friendly to their counterparts in the United States. That is, by their counterparts, I mean their ideological counterparts. The people who believe in elite rule, the people who believe that the rich should run things and the military should run things. No, we should not give support to those people. Now, that's my quick answer to that question, but you wanted to give me a few more minutes, didn't you?
Oh, I will. I will as soon as I get finished.
Okay.
What about the phrase and the Aquinos of the world?
What's that?
What about the phrase or the Aquinos of the world? Would you support them covertly?
No, I'd give them overt economic aid. I'd give everybody overt economic aid who can use it.
All right, so what you're really doing is crossing everything off the list.
I have a big magic marker, yes, and that's my greatest weapon.
And just ask Mr. Haas the equivalent question, and then you two people wrap it up. Am I correct in saying that I heard you say that you would support assassination under some circumstances?
You are correct.
Okay. Why don't you wrap this up for us from your standpoint, and then...
Well, yeah, just maybe a few quick comments on, again, not a prepared wrap-up, but a response to what Mr. Haas said, because I found his clear-cut moral difference between these terrorists who plant things in discotheques and vicious, really vicious, bad, wrong, evil, unethical. I mean, no question about it. But a real significant moral difference between that and dropping bombs on a city. When you know that civilians will be killed, you can say, I don't know which ones. I don't know exactly where. It is inevitable when you drop bombs. I speak as a former bombardier in the Air Force, and I've kept up a little with developments, because you never know. There is no such thing as a surgical strike, bombing from the air. These people are lying to us. And when Weinberger said, minimize civilian casualties, that's what he said. He didn't say we're not going to have civilian casualties. He said we're going to minimize. Minimize meant 38, including, right? I mean, no, I don't find that morally more acceptable. I find both of them evil. And it seems to me we have to eliminate both of them in the world. And I just have one more statement about interests, because Mr. Haas, you're talking about, you want to see our interests as broader, and I want to narrow our interest. It's funny, I see it sort of differently. It seems to me you want to narrow our interests, you see, to the interests of certain groups in this country who have an interest in what kind of government there is in Chile. Now, there was no national interest involved, certainly not hurt by the United States, in Allende, some left Marxist, whatever he was, a rather gentle Marxist in Chile. There was nothing hurtful to our national interest. There was something hurtful to Anaconda Copper, IT&T, and whoever, right? I mean, that's a narrow view of interest. There are narrow interests involved. The military-industrial complex is a narrow interest. I want to broaden our notion of interest. When you broaden our notion of interest beyond the large corporations and the military-industrial complex and the politicians who slaver over military actions and the journalists who follow them obsequiously, when you broaden the interest beyond that, you get to a public which then has the possibility of introducing ethical concerns into foreign policy. I want to broaden that concept of interest, and in doing that, narrow the evil that we do in the world.
I don't really have a lot to add to what I said before. Coming back on Mr. Allende for a second, I tend to agree. I think we could have tolerated Allende. I think that at times there are certain forms of change or whatever in the third world, if you would call it that, that we should be able to accept. My level of tolerance is probably greater than that of some of the colleagues I used to work with. As again, I think Allende was doing himself in. I think that would have been a far better demonstration of the bankruptcy of his economic and political policies. What is unfortunate is that we blurred that. But there were things like that, I would say. If I had been asked, I would have said we don't need covert operations there, and I would have argued against them. The only point being, though, again, it has to be case by case. There are other situations where I would argue for them, and I wish Mr. Gaddafi had perhaps thought a little bit more about the possible consequences of his own behavior before he started launching terrorist attacks around the world. I think that in looking at really the entire question of the use of force, that it's something that we just have to be willing to do at times. There are certain interests that depend upon it. In Libya, for example, now that I remembered what I was going to say, I'll stop talking around it. A greater capacity for covert actions might have, interestingly enough, precluded the necessity of doing an overt bombing. That one of the, we felt the need to respond to terrorism. We felt that all the economic and political avenues we explored were not adequate. Simply making ourselves less vulnerable to terrorism at discotheques in Europe clearly wasn't enough. All the airline security in the world is not enough. So we looked at what our options were to respond. And one of the great ironies of those who have over the last 10 or 15 years looked to, in some ways, restrict or constrain our ability to conduct covert operations, one of the results, I would argue, is that we don't have an awful lot of options. And here we were in a situation where we felt compelled to respond, and we were forced to go with a somewhat blunt instrument. And yes, you're right, Cap Weinberger was right in recognizing it, that there would be civilian damages and casualties. There was no way to avoid that. The idea of surgical bombing, I agree. I wish the phrase had never been invented. It makes it all seem much too antiseptic and much too safe. There's no such thing as surgical bombing from planes going several hundred miles an hour at several hundred feet, dropping bombs weighing over 1,000 pounds each. There ain't no such thing. People are going to die, and you're going to hit targets that you don't intend to hit. I would argue that, from my point of view, in this case it was necessary because we didn't have other ways of responding, but to me this makes a very strong argument for having a covert action capability, because in situations where you want to respond, it will give you instruments that are more tailored, and if we had had a covert capability, for all I know, we would have been better able to get only at those who were directly responsible for launching terrorism in Europe without having had any civilian casualties at all.
Thank you both very much.
Eastern University. If you'd like a cassette of this program, send a check for $10 to the Ford Hall Forum, 271 Huntington Avenue, Suite 240, Boston, Massachusetts, 02115. That's 271 Huntington Avenue, Suite 240, Boston, Massachusetts.